of the Center for Democracy and Elections. Do you really believe in these things? He is on the editorial boards of a number of journals, including New Political Economy, the Journal of Applied Philosophy, and Historical Materialism. He has been involved in a number of European projects on environmental policy, and we are extremely happy and privileged to have him here with us for the entitled course, and he will talk to us about environmental ethics and conflict, compensation, commensurability and justice. John,
okay, thanks very much. It all goes downhill after that. I always like the introduction. That's always the best bit. Right. Okay, some of you will have heard a version of this before, so to those people I apologise. Right, but hopefully it's a little bit different from the version that you've heard previously. And it comes partly out of the EJOLT project, which is almost like a parallel project to this, with a lot of interrelations about environmental justice organisations, liability and trade. I was asked to talk about environmental ethics and conflict because I'm the philosopher that comes along. I won't actually go through a lot of ethical theory. What I will do is talk about two theoretical components of the discussions here. One is about different dimensions of environmental justice. So I'll talk about different distinctions between different kinds of justice. And the other is around commensurability and value conflict. So those are the two dimensions I'll be talking about in terms of conflict and environmental conflict. But I really want to focus on two cases to exemplify that and to bring out a conflict that's actually been going on in EJOLT and in the environmental justice organisations about monetary compensation and monetary valuation. And those are the Namada Dam, which people will know about, and also the Texaco Chevron case in Ecuador. And I'll mainly focus on the second, the Texaco Chevron case. And I'll give you the background to this discussion, right, where I come from. If you pick up standard environmental economics textbook and you say, why have we got environmental problems? The standard answer that I'll give to you is because preferences for environmental goods are not revealed in market prices. So there are externalities, and you get someone like Arrow sort of exclaiming that this discovery that environmental problems are due to the non-existence of markets is an insight of purely neoclassical origin. I think he overdoes it. I think there's Austrian background to this as well, but we'll let him go. And if you take something like the Stern Review on climate change, it's a huge cost-benefit analysis, right? And it's around putting monetary valuations on that. So the origin of our market, of environmental problems then, is problems of market failure, of externalities, of cost not being internalised. And the solution, if that's the problem, is to make sure that markets do capture preferences for environmental goods. And you can do that in one of two different ways. You can actually create markets for environmental goods by creating property rights, or environmental bads in some senses as well, by creating property rights. So tradable emissions permits are like that. And you can allow them then to be directly exchanged in a market. Or you can construct prices for environmental goods by working out what people would pay if there were markets. So you shadow price. And there are a variety of ways that you do that. You can do it through hedonic pricing, where you use a good that's in a market, which has got an environmental component, and you make an inference, like house prices is the standard one you use. You can use travel cost methods, which is about how much people are willing to pay to use an environmental good or facility. Or you use contingent valuation. You go out and directly ask people how much they would be willing to pay in some hypothetical market. And you put that all then in a cost-benefit analysis. So that's the kind of standard story that you would get if I was now being an environmental economist coming up to talk to you. That's the story I would give you about the source of our environmental problems and its solution. That comes against a view that comes from almost the exact opposite direction, that the source of our environmental problems lies in the extension of markets to a growing sphere. Right, so it's about the source of a problem lies in the expansion of market mechanisms and norms. And you can tell people who talk in this way because they'll talk in terms of commodification. Right. And it's got a Marxian background, but the person that's often pulled out more recently is Polanyi. Right. So and we talked. Gavin talked a little bit about this yesterday. Right. The mobilisation of land and labour as commodities withdraws them from the constraints of ethical and social norms of various kinds. And so there's this famous passage where he says, to allow the market mechanism to be sole director of the fate of human beings and natural environment would result in the demolition of society. Robbed of the protective covering of cultural institutions, human beings would perish from the effects of social exposure. They would die as the victims of acute social dislocation through vice, perversion, crime and starvation. And then the next bit about nature. Nature will be reduced to its elements, neighbourhoods and landscapes defiled, rivers polluted, power to produce food and raw materials destroyed. So you get that. And on that view, you then get this idea of the double movement, of a movement of resistance against that growing commodification and marketisation of environmental goods. So the problem then becomes a problem, if you like, of expanding market boundaries rather than the absence of markets. And that can be an expansion in real geographical terms. So the goods, so the places which weren't before under a market sphere come under a market sphere. So it's the kind of commodity frontier which a lot of us are talking about in this course and in this project. But it's also about the expansion of markets to new spheres, the introduction of markets and mechanisms and norms into spheres of life that have previously been protected from markets. And that expansion can take different forms. It can take a direct expansion where something that previously was considered inappropriate in a market becomes seen as something that you can actually commodify. So the sale of bodily parts is a standard one that's, this is non-environmental examples now, sale of kidneys, right? The blood, sexual services, reproductive capacities. In another course I talk about the way that surrogacy, commercial surrogacy is now outsourced to India. So there's a big global market where Western commissioning parents go down to India to rent wombs from Indian women to produce children. I've got political office and the means of salvation. The political office one was kind of nice. I was involved in a cabinet office meeting on ethical constraints to trade. And there was this, the Treasury was on, there was me versus an economist. That's how it kind of worked out. And the Treasury guy was on the side of the economist until I said, well, what about selling votes or parliamentary questions? There was big parliamentary questions going. And the economist turned around and said, well, yeah. What's the problem? And at that point he kind of lost it, right? Yeah. Yeah. It was he didn't know when to stop. Right. So, but most sane economists actually think there are things that shouldn't, even Austrians think there are things that should not be in markets, right? And the question is where the boundaries of that lie. But there's also, as well as direct, this is out of date. This second bit of the slide, I should have redone this one. You'll see why it's out of date. There's also indirect forms of commodification. That is areas where the norms and relations and attitudes and forms of evaluation that are typical of markets are spread to non-market areas. I've got university education isn't yet a commodity. That's the bit that's out of date. Right, it now is. But even before it became a commodity, I used to talk about my students, not as students, I was told they were customers, right? I was involved in contracts with them, right? I wasn't an educator or a teacher, I was a provider, right? And you get this invasion of a whole market language to understand the relationship I previously had with my students and redefining it. So you get that kind of spread of market norms, even though the thing itself at that point wasn't a commodity. It now has become increasingly commodified. So if you take that view, the neoclassical project of attempting to extend prices to all environmental goods becomes an instance of this larger expansion of market boundaries. And that can be a direct expansion, so through the extension of tradable environmental goods, or indirect for the practice of monetary valuation for cost-benefit analysis. And if you take this second view, the proper response to that is to resist that expansion in various ways. And that's what you get. People responding by protesting, resisting, saying such and such a good is not for sale, it belongs to the commons, and so on. You know, and this is not a detective story, so I'll tell you where I am. I'm on that side of the debate. Right. And so, but I want to I'll give you an example, and then, which I'll come back to later on, just of this, of the Narmada Dam. Right, so this is a person, again, some of you have seen this before, so I apologise for this, but I must use a new one at some point. But I think it illustrates the point really nicely. This is a person from the Narmada Dam in Western India being displaced as a result of the dam, and he's being said, do you want to have compensation? So this is what he says in response in a letter back. He says, you tell us to take compensation. What is the state compensating us for? For our land, for our fields, for trees that grow along our fields, but we don't live only by this. Are you going to compensate us for our forest? Or are you going to compensate us for a great river, for her fish, for water, for vegetables that grow along her banks, for the joy of living beside her? What is the price of this? How are you compensating us for our fields either? We didn't buy this land, our forefathers cleared it and settled here. What price this land, our gods, the support of those who are our kin, what price do you have on these? Our Adivasi life, what price do you put on it? And the point about that he's making is there is no price for those goods. He's rejecting the attempt to treat those goods as something that you could put a price on that would compensate them for their loss. And there's a number of different dimensions of environmental justice going on there. And this is just to kind of pull out, I mean, there'll be 4 different dimensions of environmental justice I'll talk about during the talk. One, there's just a straightforward distributional injustice, right? So the cost of displacement was for a year's income times 1.5 for the Narmada Valley. Why it was times 1.5, I don't know, but that's the sum they came up with. Those people were poor. Right, so it meant the costs were low. Right. So more generally, if you take just money measures, the marginal value of any unit of monetary wealth, whether it's a euro, a dollar, a pound, is higher for a lower income person, and so you're always going to get a mistake. I mean, how much they're willing to pay is going to be lower than how much a rich person is willing to pay. And you've got that, I mean, that famously came out with the value of life on the International Panel of Climate Change several years ago, where it turned out that the value of an Indian life was much lower than the value of a Western life. And that's just purely for this reason. Right, they're poorer. Right. A second issue, mind, so there's a very straightforward distributional injustice, and there's the distributional injustice that all the harms are going to come to that small group of poor people, and the benefits are going to go somewhere else to people who are probably wealthier. It's going to fall on the worst off. A second form of injustice is a recognitional injustice, that the values at stake for those groups are not properly recognised. Right. So to use Joanne Martinez-Allier's terms, their language of valuation doesn't count. Right. The only language of valuation that counts here is a monetary language of valuation. So their language of valuation disappears. And that leads to a third dimension of environmental justice that's there, which is a procedural injustice. So the voice of those that are affected is not represented in the decision-making process. And it's not represented partly because they were a fairly powerless group, but it's also not represented because the language in which they want to speak about it can't be represented in those procedures. So you have 3 kinds of injustice there: distributional injustice, a recognitional injustice, and procedural injustice. And that's where I was at. Yeah, so that's my standard, and people who have recognised this, have seen this before. I then went in a very different context. I'll say where I originally came across this is that there's a different context of court cases where the environment is valued, monetarily valued for damages. So I was at a meeting in Paris at UNESCO. There's a big thing about costing environmental damage. And we were talking about Exxon Valdez, it was mainly about ships breaking, oil spills and so on, and people being compensated for that. And I was told by the environmental economist who worked on basically, environmental economists made a lot of money out of Exxon Valdez, I should say this, because they were on either side on the court case. So I was the environmental economist that was there on that side was on the state side. And they were pushing for contingent valuation, and Arrow, in his famous NOAA report on contingent valuation, were basically on the side of the good guys in some senses. What they were trying to do was get as much money out of the Exxon Valdez as they could, right, out of the company that had caused it. And the people that were knocking contingent valuation were all the ones on the company side, right, trying to keep the valuation low. So this environmental economist turned around to me and he said, which side are you on? You're the come along as his critic of monetary valuation, right? What the hell are you doing? You're on the bad side, right? Yeah. So suddenly I was in this debate with this guy, and that led, via the EJOLT to thinking through what's going on, where on the one hand you want to say monetary valuation involves some kind of injustice, and on another case situation you want to say justice requires monetary valuation. So what does someone who wants to screw the company as much as possible, which is me again, right? What do you do when you're in those kinds of conflict? So where this came up more strongly, more recently in EJOLT, is in the Texaco Chevron case, and this is the one that I want to go through and consider in detail. So this comes from oil extraction between 1965 and 1990 in Amazonia in Ecuador. Northern Amazonia. Basically, during that, there was formation water, what's called formation water, that was put into ponds that overflowed. And formation water involves high concentrations of toxin, which damage human health, they damage local plants, they damage the possibility of fishing in that area. So there was a large population that was affected by toxic water, this toxin in this formation water, this toxic water that was kept in ponds which weren't properly lined and which overflowed. Certain indigenous groups disappeared altogether. They died out. There was effects on a number of other indigenous groups, and there was effects on the settlers. So there was a court case supported both by the indigenous and settler populations. And they came out with a monetary valuation. So there's the money values. So there's 5.39 billion to restore polluted soil, 1.4 billion to create a health system for the community, $800 million to treat sick people affected by pollution, 600 to restore sources of water, 200 million to recover native species, 150 million to transport water from the other side of the community, to other sites to supply community, $100 million to create community cultural cohesion program, total $8.64 billion. Right. They doubled that in punitive damages and said, if Chevron doesn't apologise within 15 days, the damages come to 17.2 billion. So you've also got the price of an apology at the bottom. So the alternative title for this paper is the price of an apology. Yeah. So what's the price of an apology? But there you seem to be having monetary valuations. Right. So what's going on? Is someone like me being consistent in the one hand saying with the people at Namada, you can't put money values on this, you can't put a money value on community, and then later on saying, yeah, well, the community is 100 million. Right. What's going on in that argument? So what I want to do is try and show that what is not going on here is a monetary valuation of community. Right. I want to show that those two attitudes can be made consistent. So that's what is going on here. There's not really a monetary valuation of the goods that people said couldn't be monetary valued. So I'm going to try and show that the two are consistent. Right. Against the economists that say that they're the same. And I'll explain why the economists think the two cases are exactly the same. And I'll say why I think the economists are wrong about that, the environmental economists. Okay, is that all right so far? So people see what's going on, where it's going, and all the rest of it. Yeah? Any questions at this point? Everyone happy? Yeah, I won't go there. I always do stuff on happiness studies, all this recent happiness thing. And one of the things they do is they have this experience sampling method. I always think of this when And at this point, someone buzzes you and you say, between 1 and 10, how happy I am. Right, right. I always say to the students, where are you on the score, right, at this point? Okay. So here's the structure of what I'm going to say later on. That was that was a very long introduction. Right. I'll talk about two contexts for compensation, monetary compensation. One is cost-benefit analysis, the second is another notion of justice. So this is the fourth notion of justice I'm going to introduce, rectificatory justice. So what's going on in those two cases? I'll then go through why I think those people in Armada are quite rational and right to reject monetary compensation. Why there's reasons for it. And I'll go through two notions. One is constitutive incommensurability, and the second is the theory of welfare. I'll then go back to the court case and say why the court case is quite consistent with those reasons. And then I'll finish by saying a little bit more about the limits of compensatory or rectificatory justice, about what rectificatory justice involves. Okay? So that's the next bit. Cost-benefit analysis then. Okay, compensation is central to cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis basically uses what's called the Calder-Hicks compensation test. It's what's also known as a potential Pareto improvement. So here's Mr. Hicks writing a lot older than this. That's the, it was written in the 40s and early 50s, all of this. Mr. Hicks says, how are we to say that whether a reorganisation of production which makes A better off but B worse off marks an improvement in efficiency? So you're trying to use a Pareto notion of efficiency here, but you've got a winner and a loser, so you can't use the standard Pareto criteria. I love this next bit. A perfectly objective test. Right. Enables us to discriminate between those reorganisations which improve productive efficiency and those which do not. If A is made so much better off by the change that he could compensate B for his loss and still have something left over, then the reorganisation is an unequivocal improvement. It's a bit of bad news for if you're the loser and you're told you could be compensated and it's an unequivocal improvement, right? Even if you never are, right? It's a bit tough. And then the notion of that being a perfectly objective test is a bit bizarre, I think. But anyway, we won't. Point about that test, right? So a situation is an improvement. Situation A is improvement over B if the gains are greater than losses, so that gainers could compensate the losers and still be better off. Point about that is its consequence, because it's forward-looking, right? It's saying it's a decision-making process where we're thinking about outcomes. So we're facing forward, you know. So this is the next bit of the only bit of ethical kind of theory. I think it's what's standardly called a consequentialist view on that. There's the other situation where you find compensation involved is in what might be called rectificatory justice. And I'll say a little bit more. This is the court case now. That was cost-benefit analysis. In the court case, we were in a different situation. We're backward-looking. Right, yeah. So we're rectifying a situation. So people talk about rectificatory justice, they talk about corrective justice, they talk about compensatory justice. And the use of those terms matters for reasons I'll come back to. But the basic idea with that is that in some sense or other you're righting a wrong, right, that has been committed. So compensation is required because there has been a wrong, and this is rectification for a wrong. And that's backward-looking rather than forward-looking, right? You can't. I mean, this is part of the thing. You can't come along to someone and say, right, I'm going to beat the hell out of you, but don't worry, I'm going to pay you all the compensation afterwards, right? So you're going to be. I'll come back to that later on, but that's. So rectification normally, you know, a person can say, I'm not prepared to use to pay me in advance, right? So it's normally seen as backward-looking rather than forward-looking. And that's going to be important. What's involved in rectificatory injustice? There's three classic articulations of this in philosophy. Right. The first one, as in all these things, Whitehead said philosophy was footnotes to Plato. Most of my life it's kind of footnotes to Aristotle. Yeah, you know, so here's Aristotle. Aristotle talks about the restoration of equality. He says, the judge tries to restore this unjust situation to equality. So it's the notion of restorative justice is often introduced here. I actually like that formulation for reasons I'll come back to right at the end of the talk. but not for the reasons Aristotle had for it. But I think there's something in that formulation. And I think that's probably the best formulation. But it's not the one that people use. Right? The ones that people use are B or C, in particular C. So the second one is the restoration of status quo ante. Right, so this is Judge Brewster, right, famously in 1893, to provide a full and perfect equivalent of what was lost, and so restore completely the status quo ante. Big problem, you know, is the Larry Lohman was telling me that some activists kind of use this notion in one sense. They say, yeah, you can mine, as long as you don't disturb anything, right? And everything's the same exactly afterwards as it was before. You go ahead and mine. And the point is no mining company could operate under that. Right, yeah. So the kind of third notion, because you can't normally restore things to exactly where they were before, and what's the equivalent here. So the third notion of compensation that's standardly introduced there is restoration of people's lives to their previous level of well-being. So what justice requires, says George Scher, is that victims may be made as well off as they would be now if those wrongs had not been done. Or Lamaski, B, the transgressor is obliged to transfer resources to A, the transgressed, adequate to make A at least as well off as before the transgression occurred. And that's the one that economists pick up on. And a nice formulation of it is from Nozick, right, which brings it out well. So Nozick says, something fully compensates a person for a loss if and only if it makes him no worse off than he would have otherwise have been. It compensates a person X for Y's action A if X is no worse off receiving it, Y having done A, than X would have been without receiving it if Y had not done A. Right, and you get this little bit in brackets, which I think captures where economists come in nicely. In the terminology of the economists, something compensates X for Y's act if receiving it leaves X on at least as high in difference curve as he would have been without it, had Y not so acted. And then if you've got that formulation, economists are straight in. Like straightforward environmental economists are straightforward, or economists generally are straight into court cases. This is why economists appear in court cases. Because what they're supposed to be able to compute is the amount of money which leaves a person at the same welfare level as they were before, at the same point on that classic indifference curve as they were before. So that's what economists do. And in environmental cases, the way you do that is exactly the same way as you did in the cost-benefit analysis. So how do you ascertain the welfare losses associated with the loss of environmental goods? You go out and do your valuation. You do your shadow pricing. And you either use hedonic pricing, or you use travel cost methods, or you use contingent valuation. And in the Exxon Valdez, the reason why there was this famous report on contingent valuation was whether contingent valuation would give the full welfare losses involved. So what the court cases were arguing about, why the economists were there, was actually arguing about what the welfare losses were in monetary terms, so you knew exactly what the level of compensation was. So you're using exactly the same methods as you did in cost-benefit analysis and in the court cases. And the claim is, in both of them, you're measuring through money welfare gains and losses. They're exactly symmetrical. Right, so if I come along and say, from this point of view, this is why the environmental economist was so hard on me, right? That's why he was trying to give me a hard time. Right, if I come along and say, you can't do that in the Namada case, then they're saying, well, you can't do it in this case either. There isn't an objective measure of monetary compensation. Right. He's saying, I wanted to make sure all the welfare losses were captured, right? So I wanted to use contingent valuation. So you critics of contingent valuation, like John O'Neill, you're the bad guy. Right, that was the story. Okay, so that's the story so far. So again, this is me presenting what the economist wants to say about those cases. Is that okay? Okay, so what I want to do now is return to the first case, the Namada Dam case, and cases like that, where people refuse to accept monetary compensation. And I want to say why I think they're rational to refuse it. So here's the quote again. I won't read it out again. You know, he's saying, what's the price of the life of our kin? What's the price of this river? What's the price of our way of life? What price do you have on it? There isn't a price. Right. So people can refuse compensation like that. People can refuse compensation even if it's offered. I'll come back to this later on. There's what's euphemistically called comfort women in South Korea and Taiwan, who are basically forced prostitutes under the Japanese invasion, who were offered real monetary compensation. I'll come back to the case in a moment. They said, we're not taking it. And there's reasons why they refuse to take it. So people come along and they refuse monetary compensation. They actually refuse lots of money, right, for certain reasons. And you get this in everyday responses to contingent valuation. So this is from work that Jackie Burgess did a long time ago. And it's people saying, it's disgusting putting a price on nature. Right, you can't put a price on the environment, you can't put a price on what you're going to leave to your children, it's heritage, it's not an open capital market. And you can get very high protest values in this kind of case. So people protest, they resist, they don't want to accept, they reject the idea you can price capture those kind of welfare gains and losses in monetary terms. Is that rational? Yeah, I think so. The first notion I want to pick up is constitutive incommensurability. Commensurability simply means, value commensurability means that there's a single measure for capturing different dimensions of value, so you can measure gains and losses. Economists basically say you do have value commensurability because there is a measure, which is money, prices. Right, yeah. So that's your measure, so it's monetary commensurability. And that's what you're doing in your willingness to pay. Here is I love it. People again have seen this before, so I apologise, but it's still my favourite. This is the earliest willingness to pay survey I've ever come across. It's a willingness to accept survey. Actually someone's found an earlier one in the Bible, but I don't think it says it as nicely. But this is from Herodotus' history. So it's when Darius was king of the Persian Empire, he summoned the Greeks who were in his court and asked them how much money it would take for them to eat the corpses of their fathers. They responded they would not do it for any price. Afterwards, Darius summoned some of the Indians, who are called the Calatai, who do eat their parents, and asked in the presence of the Greeks for what price they would agree to cremate their dead fathers. They cried out loudly and told him to keep still. Point about that story would be completely ruined if I say, how much to eat your mum and dad? Right, so I now do a monetary valuation here. How much are people willing to pay to eat their mum and dad at the funeral? Right. It would be terrible if people say, 3,000 dinar, 4,000, right, yeah. 5,000 euro, yeah, to eat my dad, right, yeah. My mum's probably tastier, so I've got lower value for that, right. The point about that, the whole story, is he picks out people's commitments of various kinds by what they refuse to pay, by the fact that they refuse to pay it. And the point here is that paying money, a price, isn't simply a neutral measuring device. It's not the measuring rod of money, which is the famous, the lovely expression that economists use from Pigou, actually. Right. Acts of exchange are social acts that have a social meaning. And there are certain kinds of social relationships and there are certain kind of ethical commitments which are constituted. What they are, is what makes them what they are, is that people refuse to put a price on them. So social loyalties are like that. Right. And ethical commitments are like that. So social loyalty, I mean, it's not that Judas, $30 of silver was pretty rubbish as a price, but if you'd gone for 500, it would have been, the Bible story would have been different, right? Yeah. You simply don't sell commitments like that. Right. You don't accept indecent proposals, to take the other, the movie titles and so on. There's certain kinds of social relations and commitment which, basically, if you accepted money, it's an act of betrayal. And someone trying to offer you money, you're trying to bribe you. Right. They're trying, in some sense, to undermine your commitment. And environmental goods are like that, right? Environments matter because they express a set of social relationships. And that's what's happening in the Marder case. They're not saying just this physical bit of good, what does it matter? They're saying our way of life, how much price are you putting on that? Our social relations, how much price are you putting on that? And likewise, if you've got certain commitments, ethical commitments about certain environmental goods. If someone comes along and says how much you're willing to pay to give those up, is like saying let's resolve, I mean, here's another ethical thing, let's resolve the hanging dispute or the abortion debate by simply doing a monetary valuation on either side, and then we'll do a nice cost-benefit analysis and we'll resolve it. It's not the kind of way that you think about. People say, I'm not willing to, you know, change my view because you're willing to pay me so much money. Right. So money then is not a neutral measuring rod. Values, not all values can be caught within a monetary metric. And I think that's right. So you have what's called constitutive incommensurability. That's a term from Joseph Raz. And I think that's right. A second point here. So that's the first point I wanted to make was that one about constitutive incommensurability. The second is about the theory of welfare, or that's underlying this whole valuation. What is it to leave a person at least as well off as they would have been? Right. What's the theory of welfare that's underlying that? Basically, the standard neoclassical model assumes a preference satisfaction account of well-being. Right. So a person is at least as well off in a new situation, A, relative to an old situation, B, if A is at least as preferred as B. Which is where you get the indifference curves. The indifference curves is points that are equally preferred on a line. Right. And you get these lovely smooth, continuous indifference curves. And if preferences is just a matter of, so if welfare is just a matter of preference satisfaction, as long as your preference satisfaction stays identical, you can move anywhere you want to live along that curve. So a loss of one dimension in environmental goods, there's a gain somewhere else, and you have an equal preference between those two bundles of goods. And money, in this case, is just giving you the trade-off schedule. So money is just the metric you're using to represent that other bundle of goods, and people are being left equally satisfied. Yeah. So if you assume that theory of welfare, there's lots, as long as you think that people's preferences aren't lexicographic, you make lots of other assumptions, there's lots of substitutability that you can have. A different theory of welfare is an objective state account, which says that welfare is about satisfying certain needs, or the more recent version is the SEN version of functionings, capabilities for functionings. So this is the philosopher in me. How am I doing for time? I could leave this one out, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll leave it out. Right. Anyone wants this one? Is what happens when an analytical philosopher gets hold of stuff. Right. How long have I got? Yeah, I'll try and get through the next bit fairly quick. Point about, this is just saying there's a difference in the logic of preferences and needs. I won't go through that. But what I do want to say is just the conclusion. Whether a person needs something depends on the objective condition of the person and the nature of the object. Right. Its capacity to contribute to flourishing. Whether a person prefers an object or not is simply based on their beliefs. There's something subjective about preference which is not there in objective conceptions. Second point about needs is a threshold concept. There are upper and lower limits, right, for food, for water, for friends, despite Facebook. Right, yeah. You can have too many friends, there's too few. There's upper and lower limits. And there's a feature of what I'll call non-instrumental needs. A non-instrumental need is a need that's a condition for human flourishing at all. Right, there's certain needs I've got which are purely instrumental. So I say I need to fly to, I need £1,000. You say why? I say, well, I need it to pay for that holiday down in that cruise down in the Mediterranean. You say, well, do you really need to go to the Mediterranean? Right. This is purely instrumental. It's an optional outcome. If I say I need £1 to some beggar, I say why? It's for some food, and I turn around and say, you really need some food, right? Yeah. Doesn't make sense. I mean, clearly they need it, right? Yeah. It's a non-optional thing. And so non-instrumental needs are those kind of needs which are a condition for being a flourishing human being at all. And it's not just food and water. It includes things like social relations, education, literacy. I mean, there's a whole series of other goods that come onto that. So if you fall under that level, you're harmed in some way. So needs and functionings are, on the one hand, their objective. Second, their threshold. Third feature of them is there's lots of them. They're plural. So if you take, I'll take a Nussbaum's list. You take this list of bodily health, practical reason, affiliation. I'll leave the last one off. Being able to have good health, being able to have a form of conception of the good, engage with others, being able to live with and towards others. You take goods like that, they appear on standard objective lists. The point about those is that you can't, they're plural. Right. You can't come along and say, I can't come along to you and say, well, I'll deprive you of your family, but it's okay because I'll give you better TV, right, up here. Or I can't sort your health out, but I can give you another friend. You can't substitute across those different dimensions of well-being. So there's limits of substitutability. And that's where I think, ordinary language is much better, I generally think this, ordinary language is much better than the technical language of economists. People will say there's no substitute for good health and good friends. And they're right. Despite economists telling you that there's substitutes for everything. There's certain goods which are minimal requirements to live a good life at all. And when you lose those, there's no compensation in another dimension. And that's where the Namada people are exactly right, the people protesting at the Namada. So a person that's facing eviction from a place where they've lived their entire life and where the life of their community lives and it crosses generations, you can't take them away and say, well, okay, you're going to lose all of that, you're going to suffer social dislocation, but it's okay because we'll give you a health centre over here. They're losing something, which is an irreplaceable loss. Right. So the loss of basic goods in the dimension of affiliation can't be compensated for a gain in other dimensions. And similarly, for the same reason, there's no sum of money which is going to compensate for that loss. Okay, so with that, that's why I think those protests that say there's no money valuations that do the job here are perfectly rational. There isn't a monetary valuation. So with that in mind, let's go back to the Chevron Texaco case and see if the court case is compatible with that rejection of monetary valuation. So if you go to the Chevron case, there's two kinds of losses. There's the adverse effect on health that they talk about, including high rates of cancer, miscarriages, child mortality rates, genetic malformation, and there's the impact on the indigenous communities, the fact that those communities were dislocated and disrupted. So there's displacement of ancestral territories and the loss of identity and cultural integrity. The kind of things that people in the Namada case were worried about losing are happening here. So the response is health programs and community building programs paid for by the company based on the cost of projects elsewhere. Right. Point I want to make about that, and I'll say this in a bit more detail now, is that first of all the distinct dimensions are being addressed. It's not thinking there's just a sum of money which could compensate you for the loss. Second, there's no suggestion that there's a level of money which could restore previous welfare levels. Right. So what's happening here is the aim is to address wrongs that have been committed in those dimensions of loss, health and community. It's not an attempt to say there's a monetary valuation which will restore you to your previous levels. And there's a good reason for that. Right, so here's the court case. I just want to read a little bit of this out because I think it captures. Thus, it's not possible in order for the individualised remediation of the health of the persons affected, which are underdetermined, but measures can be ordered that equally address the problem in general, such as health improvement plan, as requested as part of the plaintiff's pursued remedies. Thus, the defendant is ordered to defray the cost for the implementation of a health system, and that's where you get your $1.4 billion. Also amongst the mitigation measures, cultural damage is addressed, since the occurrence described of the impacts to the indigenous peoples is a consequence of the conduct of the defendant. Therefore, the implementation is ordered of a community rebuilding and ethnic reaffirmation program, which will be covered by the amount of the defendant for $100 million, based on a similar project somewhere else. The point about that is the first sentence kind of says it. it doesn't involve the claim, doesn't involve any of these claims, that it doesn't deny that community can't be captured in monetary valuations, that there's constitutive incommensurability. It doesn't assume that there's a sum of money that can restore people to their previous levels of welfare. And it doesn't assume that you can actually substitute across those different dimensions of welfare. So none of the assumptions that underlie standard monetary valuation apply. And in fact, the first sentence of the ruling, if you go back to it, says you can't restore people to their previous level of well-being. And it's obvious that you can't, because some of the people are not even around anymore. They've all died, right? And it's pretty, short of Catholic miracles, it's pretty tough to sort that one out, right? So you've got the death and disappearance of groups. And so just as you can't restore a situation to the status quo prior to it, you can't restore people to their previous levels of well-being. That notion of compensation, which underlies the economist's involvement in court cases like this, is a myth, right? There's real losses in situations like that, and there's no compensation for those losses, right? There's no monetary valuation that's going to take them back to where they were. What you've really got here is what you might call remedial action. You've identified losses in welfare in various dimensions, and you take some remedial action which addresses those losses without the assumption that you're going to restore anybody to their prior level of well-being. So what the proposal aims to do, what the court case aims to do, is address wrongs that are committed in those dimensions and take what remedial action is possible. Right. It's about, righting a serious wrong. It's not about restoring a level of well-being, which is what monetary valuation is trying to do. And what that comes out really nicely is in the price of the apology. So I'll just finish briefly on the price of the apology. So I'll go back. What does rectificatory justice require then? It's righting a wrong in some sense. It's not just a matter of restoring a level of well-being. So, and the point about that is monetary compensation in itself, this is what people have said for a long time, doesn't actually recognise that necessarily that a wrong has been done. And that's where the price of the apology comes in, which is not a price of apology. So you get, okay, I'll give you some other cases. I'll talk about the comfort case, right? Women in South Korea were offered actual money, lots of money, right, in compensation. They refused it. Why did they refuse it? Firstly, because it was from private funds. It wasn't a Japanese state fund. And secondly, there was no official apology. And they're saying, well, we're not going to accept that. That's like accepting a payoff, is what you'd say. It's not really a case of rectificatory justice at all, because no one has recognised the wrong involved. So people talk about symbolic compensation. I don't think symbolic compensation is the right word, because it's still got that compensatory kind of message. Right. But if you go to the court case, where are we? We get the price of the apology. So if Chevron doesn't publicly apologise within 15 days, the damages are doubled. If you look at the court case, why that's the case, first, most of it's about punitive damages. So the doubling was to stop people doing the same thing again. And economists recognise that. This is where economists would say straightforward consequentialist. But the second point about saying, well, if you apologise in 15 days, within 15 days it doesn't get paid, is this point at the bottom. So it says, this public recognition of damage caused must be published no later than 15 days in a leading print media in Ecuador and the country of the defendant's domicile on 3 different days, which, if done, shall be considered a symbolic measure of moral redress and a recognition of the effects of their misconduct, as well as a guarantee that it shall not be repeated. And it's that symbolic dimension that's going on there, which is what the price of the apology is about. It's not about restoring someone to a previous level of well-being without the apology. It is about punitive damages, but it's not just about that. The reason why they gave them this option was to allow the fact that they didn't have to pay the damages if there was this public apology, which of course the company didn't do. So this is kind of history. So as I say, there's 2 components to the ruling. One is to ensure punitive damages to
act as a deterrent, that X is an expressive act, symbolic measure of moral interest and the recognition of the effects of misconduct. So what I basically wanted to say here is that there's no inconsistency between, this is my long reply to that economist. Right, and it's taken me a long time to get around to saying it, and he's not around yet. I'll have to find out where he is. Right, so he's not heard this yet. So that's I think it's quite consistent to say you can't monetarily value those goods, because what's not going on here isn't a monetary valuation of community. It's not a monetary valuation of health. What it's concerned about is a remedial action. The final thing that I wanted to say is simply, I have a worry generally about compensation and compensatory justice, which is the notion that the prior status quo is your benchmark. And the problem with that is the prior status quo might be a state of injustice in the first place. So my kind of hypothetical case here, if anyone can give me an actual case, it would be great, is that you have hotel developers who have taken someone's, excluded certain marginal group that were cockle fishing or shell fishing in a certain area, who are then put onto marginal beds, and that gets lost through pollution. If you take the status quo prior to the polluting act, then you give lots of money to the hotel owners and not very much to the marginal group who's being excluded. What you really want to say is that's not the status quo that we should be concerned about. We should be concerned with a prior state of justice, which is why I like the original Aristotelian formulation. Right, because the original Aristotelian formulation is that you're restoring the situation to one of justice or equality. And I think if you're going to think about compensatory justice, that's what you should be thinking about. And I think rectificatory justice is better. So it's about restoring a situation to justice, not simply to the prior status quo. And that's another reason why I don't think simply using monetary valuation is going to capture what's going on here. So I was a bit fast through that last bit because I was aware of the time, but I hope that was followable, and thanks very much.